This is a Global Original podcast. Hello and welcome to Rachel Johnson's Difficult Women. In each episode, I'll be talking to a woman who has had to fight, resist, insist, or otherwise behave badly to get where they are today. Sometimes my guests don't fit the descriptor difficult women, but this week's ferociously intelligent, terrifyingly honest novelist, whose international hit novel about a high school mass murderer served as an effective literary contraceptive to millions of women, does. Lionel Shriver, author of more than a dozen novels, including the classic study of maternal ambivalence We Need to Talk About Kevin, has spoken out against cancel culture, immigration, lockdowns, masks, and spoken out for cultural appropriation and basically the rights of freeborn men and women to do what they damn well like. It's hard to know where to begin, Lionel. Should we start at the beginning? Was your childhood in North Carolina difficult?
I think as childhoods go, no, it wasn't. It had its particular difficulties, but I certainly am not shopping for pity. I was clothed and housed and fed.
Those sounds like the basic.
That's where we have to start.
The basic. You had the basic.
Gravy.
Well, no, not these days when everyone's a victim-y. Everyone thinks their childhood was terrible and, relishes and revels in victim status. But you think you had the basics and that was sufficient?
Yes. I mean, it was a family that had some problems, conflicts, like a normal family. My parents were very religious. None of their three children ended up being religious. So that created some friction. And my older brother was quite a renegade. And my parents were liberal politically, but not liberal socially at that time. They got more liberal, but too late for me to benefit from it. So, he smoked and drank and took drugs and slept with women and broke my parents' heart.
And you were a good girl?
I learned from my brother to lie. So my brother broke the rules out in the open, for which I have far more admiration than my strategy, which was to be secretive and to break the rules and lie about it.
So he didn't seek to please them. You sought to have it both ways, to please them and also secretly do what you like, which sounds like a good strategy.
It was strategically sophisticated, but morally questionable.
I see. And did you do well in school?
Yes, I did. I was a SWAT.
That's a very English word. Do you say that in the States?
No, but I say it now.
Girly SWAT is a term of opprobrium. It's, in this country, people are supposed to be effortlessly superior and brilliant, but you don't pretend, you work hard. You're famously hard on yourself. I read that you go to bed at 5 a.m. I can't believe that's true. And you only eat one meal a day. I've seen you, so I can believe that's true because you're super fit and lean and you're a sort of, you've got a kind of very coiled energy. Do you think that you are hard on yourself?
Not particularly. No, I don't regard any of those regimes as being hard on myself.
Oh, really?
No, I regard all of that as self-preservational.
In a physical sense or in a sort of psychological sense? Both?
Both.
Yeah.
I think in my personal mythology, if I lift all the rules, then I just go to hell.
If you lift all the rules?
I'd probably just spend all day, stuffing my face and go through 3 bottles of wine a day.
But you wrote a book about somebody who does that or who is based on your brother. So that's very, obviously his choices have been very influential on your choices.
Yes, my older brother was a cautionary tale about what happens when you not only break the rules in a social sense, but you break other rules that you'd really be better off adhering to out of self-interest. I mean, he was an alcoholic for many years. He became a crack addict for a little while, and he was living out of his car. He later got addicted to prescription drugs. And then when nothing else was left, he ate. So,
do you think that's the cheapest form of addiction?
Oh, definitely. Although not in its consequences.
Arguably, I had this conversation with someone who said that the worst addiction in life was adultery. It wasn't something, any stimulant you could consume. It was something that really did destroy your family.
Well, that's an interesting viewpoint. Yeah, I'm not quite sure what being addicted to adultery looks like, but it's not one of my problems. My husband will be happy to hear.
Yeah, well, actually, on my last podcast, the last guest told her husband, safe in the knowledge he probably wouldn't listen to the podcast, that he should ask her for her hand in marriage. Anyway, I'm not sure how that turned out in the end. Is your brother alive now? Did he read the book, Big Brother?
No, he died in 2009.
Okay, so you safely wrote the book knowing that he wasn't going to read it or be upset by it, which must have been a release.
Well, it was nice not to have to worry about hurting his feelings. That's certainly true, but it was also frustrating that he didn't get the elements of the book that were a tribute to him. I dedicated the book to him. In fact, this is the second book that I've dedicated to people who are dead, and I have to say, it's a dubious practice.
What was
it's a wasted
dedication? What was the other one, Lionel?
To my father-in-law.
And he's now dead.
He was already dead then also. So, I think my advice to other fiction writers is we should probably save these tributes to people who are still capable of appreciating them.
Exactly. It's like a free goal, it's a free hit. Use it. I've sort of run out of people to dedicate my terrible books to. I think I remember Wilbur Smith always dedicates his novels to Danielle, but I must dedicate one to my remaining parent, I think. Have you ever...
That is an interesting stage of life.
Yeah.
For authors, is to get to the point where it's really hard to think of somebody you haven't dedicated a book to that you care about.
Was my introduction fair about the things that you've spoken out against and the things you've spoken out in support of?
Yes, I would say it was quite accurate.
What would you like to start with? I mean, what I admire about you, amongst many other things, including your writing, which is fantastic, addictive, as we've been talking about addiction, is you are fearless. You're not on social media. You don't, as it were, hear the noise. You don't feel the blowback when you say something you believe to be right. And I think we need more people like you. Let's start, if I may, with cancel culture. How did you feel when you were told to edit part of your book so that you weren't othering an African character, for example? Did you feel that you were part of cancel culture, or did you think that was legit and valid for the publisher to ask?
I revised the dialogue a little bit. It wasn't, in principle, that important to me. I didn't think that I was making a huge artistic sacrifice. I wouldn't have changed anything if I did think it was an artistic sacrifice. I'm not going to damage the quality of the book, but I was able to rejig a very short passage of dialogue in a way that was still accurate in terms of expressing how someone from Africa might speak, for whom English was a second language.
Okay, so no biggie.
I compromised. I
But
made a rule that I would anything that I could make an actual proper English word, I would use, even if it was a misusage. So I didn't transcribe any accent. On a larger level, however, I don't think that I should have to be worrying about this. I mean, I get a little exasperated by the kind of hypersensitivity with which anyone on the page is met when they are not, let's not beat around the bush, when they're not white.
So you think that a white author is now subject to more prescriptive editing and expectation than a BAME one?
Very much.
But going back to Sebastian Faulks, he just said that he wouldn't write a gay character. He wouldn't write in the voice of a woman now. To me, that seems like you're saying, I'm not going to be a novelist.
Yeah, I find that shocking, especially the latter. I mean, that he wouldn't want to write from the perspective of a woman. Of course, this is where we're headed. This is what I predicted back in 2016, that if you take the whole notion of cultural appropriation to its ultimate conclusion, then all you write is autobiography. So nobody else's story belongs to you. One of the things that's extraordinary is this notion that even the stories that you make up and the characters you make up don't belong to you. And that's absurd. But we've now got to the point where if you write a gay character or a trans character or a Pakistani character, all of these, they immediately belong to a group outside your book. They have become little diplomatic representatives of a whole conglomeration of people. They are not just your own creation with whom you can, tell whatever story you want. And, I push back against this notion. I believe that when I create a character, that character belongs to me, and I can do with that character whatever I like. But the truth is that in the current environment, if white writers in particular invent characters who are somewhat different from themselves, those characters are going to be scrutinized. The text is going to be scrutinized. The dialogue is going to be scrutinized. And people are going to look for some way in which you have offended current cultural sensibilities. And that's so easy to do that basically, you can count on the fact that someone looking to be offended is going to succeed.
Why aren't publishers just pushing back on it? Why does it take authors to say, we novelists create? You have a blank page, you have total freedom. I mean, why aren't publishers, as editors, support their journalists when, they're accused of libel or, treading on toes or writing something that somebody else doesn't want written? That is the object of journalism. The object of publishing should be to publish authors and to aid and abet their creative expression.
Well, first off, I'm afraid that my fellow fiction writers have been most subdued in terms of defending their creative rights. And there are a lot of explanations for that, one of them being, of course, that most fiction writers, for reasons that are a little beyond me, are overwhelmingly on the political left. And they don't want to upset their fellow left-wing advocates, and they don't want to tarnish their reputations amongst their political bedfellows. So, they just keep their heads down. And I'm very sympathetic with other writers who just want to get on with their work and don't necessarily want to be activists and don't want to write nonfiction articles about defending their right to exercise their imaginations. I mean, I think that's in many ways justifiable, but that means that someone has to stick up for our collective rights, and that's what I've tried to do. What has made that doubly difficult is what you brought up, which is that it's not only writers who are not sticking up for their rights, but their publishers are not either. So, I mean, publishing has been wholesale captured by the hard left and is now obsessed with imposing left-wing orthodoxies. And those orthodoxies keep changing. They get only stricter. So the people who are starting to get caught out as heretics are actually fellow liberals, often, people who are indeed trying to toe the line and are still failing. I mean, that Kate Clancy nonsense was a very good example.
Yeah, nobody can survive the purity spiral, from J.K. Rowling to Margaret Atwood, as you say, Kate Clancy. As soon as you dip your toe in this water, you are in up to your neck. I mean, you can see why people less brave and ballsy than you just knuckle down and fold and say, as Sebastian Faulks did, I wouldn't write a gay character. On TERF, what is your position on the current hot potato, which is women like Kathleen Stock being cancelled for saying, in my view, completely rightly, by the way, I've said this before, I'll carry on saying it, if you're born female, it's different from if you say you identify as a woman.
Well, I guess I'm a happy TERF. I never thought I'd see the day that I'd have to defend the idea that there is such a thing as biological sex, but that's where we are. So I'm a big believer in biological sex. There is such a thing. You can take hormones and you can get surgery, and that's your business as far as I'm concerned, especially if you're of age. But your biological sex is written into your DNA, and it is a part of every cell in your body, and you can't change that. So is that the end of my career, putting that out there?
No way. I mean, the thing is that Robert Winston can say exactly what you've said on Question Time, and nobody bats an eyelid. But if a middle-aged white woman like me or you says it, there's a pile-on. Why is that?
Well, there are other nonfiction writers who could explain it to you better than I. But from what I've read, because this is not first-person experience, the trans activists who are most aggressive, most vocal, are men who have decided they want to live as women and are very resentful of real women, as far as I can tell, or and I don't quite understand where all the fury comes from. They are attacking people who have no interest in saying that trans people shouldn't have the same civil rights as everyone else. They draw the line only in relation to very specific female-only spaces, like domestic violence refuges and prisons, and they don't believe that men, that is male-bodied, as we say, male-bodied people.
We don't say that
competing in women's sports, but
Yeah.
But other than that, I mean, what's being said is very mild, and yet it seems to drive this particular group of people into a frenzy.
Yes, they call it transphobia. What's odd is that we don't call men people with prostates, but women are now reduced to for their body parts, by the Lancet or by the BMJ or by, the Department of Health, women, people who menstruate or people with cervixes. I'm extraordinarily offensive to me and insulting to the female experience. One of my favourite things about you is that you once said, "Why does anyone have kids?" And of course, anyone who's read We Need to Talk About Kevin would ask the same question. You don't have kids. Do you still wonder why anyone would have kids?
Well, I've never proselytized for childlessness, and I'm a big admirer of people who volunteer to become parents. And without them, the human race would cease to exist, which, appeals to me on some days. but on more kindly ones, I'm grateful. It's a huge job. It's very difficult. It doesn't come with an instruction manual. And you never know who you're going to get. And that's a lot of what We Need to Talk About Kevin is addressing, is what a leap of faith it is to have children. And, I'm hoping that most parents luck out, but then sometimes you don't. And, of course, it's when you don't that is providing fodder for novels of the sort that I write. But I'm a big admirer of people who become parents and try to do a good job. It's a pretty thankless task. Your children are likely to be actively grateful late in the day.
It's only when you become parents, you become a parent, that you realize what your parents went through, basically. Until that point, you resent them and, mark their card for every time they didn't come to the play or the parent-teacher evening. As soon as you've got children, you realize that, they don't thank you for the things you do. They criticize you for the things you didn't do. Anyway, can we move towards the current climate? We're just coming out of, I guess, is it the third or fourth pandemic era or third or fourth lockdown era? We're sort of heading towards Christmas and people talking about restrictions again. We completely are on the same page when it comes to this. Lockdowns, if lockdowns work, why did we have to have another one? If they don't work, why did we have to have another one? To me, it was the most self-defeating, nationally destructive act since Brexit. But I know you were in favour of Brexit, so let's leave that aside. You came out with another very ringing line, which was you'd never been more ashamed of this country. Can you explain why you said that?
I was really surprised by the acquiescence to lockdowns, and I've been disappointed by how little people have questioned them. There's plenty of information out there if you want to avail yourself of it, demonstrating that across the world, lockdowns have achieved virtually nothing epidemiologically. To the extent that they've had any effect, it's only been to slightly delay infections that happened anyway, and the collateral damage has been stupendous. And, it is arguable that lockdowns have actually killed more people than COVID, especially in the developing world, which we don't tend to pay any attention to in this particular regard. So, it's been disappointing. I have always thought of Britain as a bastion of liberty, and the democratic traditions that my own country was founded on really derive from these islands, and I'm sorry how readily everyone folded. Now, I realize that they were persuaded that this is just, like the Blitz, and we all have to bandy together and make our sacrifices for the community. But, when somebody is asking you to sacrifice virtually all of your civil liberties, and that ended up including the right to freedom of speech. I mean, there's been a lot of aggressive censorship of dissenting opinion on COVID policy. So you're really obliged to look at it twice at least, and not simply say, oh, well, the government says I can't go out and protest their policy, so I won't. It's been a real education. It's been another one as to how readily cultures and countries can transform, apparently on a dime. I found it really frightening on that level, much more so than the disease, which has a 0.23% fatality rate. I think that the political consequences of lockdowns, especially repeated lockdowns with which we are still being threatened, are much more considerable than the epidemiological consequences. We will never again live in a world where Western countries, which consider themselves liberal democracies, confer rights on the citizenry that cannot be withdrawn. We can now withdraw them on a dime. And we will always be able to withdraw them on a dime because it's been done before. We can't call it unprecedented any longer. And I think that has damaged the political culture of the entire Western world. I mean, I think that China must be looking on and cackling.
Well, we've become like China. I mean, from having been a country, which I was born in, where everything was allowed unless it was specifically prescribed by law, we became a country where nothing was allowed unless it was specifically prescribed by law. You can see your mother in her care home. You can go to a shop, a non-essential shop. I mean, I felt like you, complete bafflement, outrage and anger. And we're still, what worries me now is I look up I'm sitting in LBC studio, I'm looking up at the House of Commons. The Labour backbenchers behind Sir Keir Starmer are all wearing masks, which you likened the removal of statues to a form of theatre. I think the cultural landscape is now infested by COVID theatre. They aren't sitting there wearing masks because they work, because it's a sort of signalling that I'm a good guy, I care. And I also feel, I don't know whether you agree with me, that people have become addicted, this is becoming a theme, to these restrictions, to this culture of fear that we all have to, we're in some sort of war against the virus. It's like something's come into our lives that has meaning, and I'm worried that COVID is that thing.
I think there's something to that, in that this pandemic and the hysteria around it has lasted so long. It's become definitive of a discrete era, and it becomes how you conceive of the present. It's what's in your newspaper. It's what you're supposed to be thinking about. It's like any kind of crisis. It introduces a sense of exciting urgency, and there's something about the adherence to restrictions that makes people feel purposeful and righteous, and here they are doing their part.
I'm afraid I never felt that myself. I felt, I'm afraid it all brought out the very worst in me. I'm sure it brings out the best in others. It didn't bring out the best in me at all. Do you think it's possible to write a good lockdown or pandemic novel? Or do you think that, unlike the Second World War, which has spawned, so many titles, so many million novels, so many million non-fiction books, there's something peculiarly undramatic about a pandemic? It's very unsexy just being told as a woman to go back and stay home.
Oh, I'm sure there will be successful lockdown novels. The problem with it is that the phenomenon is inherently static, to the degree that it puts together a theater. It is a hothouse one. You're going to put characters in a set of rooms and they can't leave, and that makes it possible to do certain kinds of drama, but not others. It's very likely to be much more domestic literature.
And claustrophobic.
Yes.
In your new book, you deal with another subject that makes me very hot under the collar, which is assisted dying. I'm very much in favour of it. I presume this is, I should say, Should We Stay or Should We Go, which is about a couple who both worked within the NHS who make a pact to kill themselves on his 81st and her 80th year, I think I'm right in saying. At the end of the book, did you wonder whether you'd be asked whether you would kill yourself at a certain point in your life, whether you'd make a similar pact, Lionel? Do you think it's possible to carry it out?
Of course it's possible to carry it out. I have not made any kind of vow to myself or anyone else that I'm going to kill myself in a particular year. So those of you who are waiting are going to be disappointed.
Counting the days.
Yes. And, there's a slight artifice to the premise, but it makes the book possible. I should clarify for your listeners that though it sounds like a real downer of a book,
it's a comedy.
It's actually quite playful, and it's a parallel universe book that has 12 different outcomes, depending on whether they go through with it or not, or one of them goes through with it, and explores what, if they don't go through with it, they are going to miss out on, either something really great, in which case they would have made a terrible mistake in following through with their pact, or they would have escaped something really terrible. And of course, I'm better on that stuff. So, I think it's a fun book, though it certainly is entertaining some serious subjects. I also support assisted dying legislation.
It's going through the House of Lords now, the assisted dying bill.
But I think that the big surprise for these timid legislators is, even if it were improbably to pass, how few people will end up taking advantage of it.
No, I'm sure that's right.
Because that's really what I took out of the experience of writing Should We Stay or Should We Go? And that is, don't underestimate how fiercely you do want to keep living. I've always thought of myself as putting very strict conditions on the circumstances under which I wish to stick around. But I think those conditions start changing as you get older. And the truth is, I probably would be willing to stick around even if I can't play tennis anymore. And
I think
20
that's
years
a tough
ago,
one.
I'm not sure I'd say that.
I didn't know you played tennis, Lionel. We should play. I'm addicted to that too. I'm looking through the notes. It seems to me that the thing that triggered others most that you've said in a quite a crowded field is your views on immigration as a native, not a native born Britisher, but you now live here in Bermondsey with your husband. Can you explain your views on immigration and why it's become a non-subject? Again, you can be cancelled for questioning mass immigration.
Well, the column that got me into so much trouble this summer was submitting what I thought was a mild and self-evident observation that native populations that experience mass influx by foreigners, that is just people who weren't born there, universally experience some resentment. And it doesn't necessarily have to do with race. And so, I looked at how South Africans, Black South Africans, are antagonistic with incoming Zimbabweans. In Colombia, they've had to put up with a huge influx of Venezuelans. In Nigeria expelled a huge number of Ghanaians and were applauded by the native population. And this is Black people with Black people. So if Britons feel passingly uncomfortable or uneasy with the idea of the nature of their population changing, their demographics changing very, very rapidly, then that is normal. That is human. I just said it is human nature to be both political and territorial. So we tend to clump into groups and to guard our territory. And so it's not some kind of exclusive white person problem. It is an everybody problem. And with so many people on the move, this is it's an emotional and political issue we have to deal with.
But going back to what you said about the author's right to write what he or she wants to, you said that white authors don't have that freedom anymore. Are you also making a correlation with, if you're a white person, as it were, interrogating the mass migration incursions by what you regard as foreigners into your own land, that is now no longer tolerated?
That is correct. And I've actually been saying this for a long time. I've said it for decades, that even if you're very enthusiastic about immigration, which everyone is supposed to be now, it is in everyone's interest for you to at least concede that everyone doesn't feel that way, and that it's not necessarily racist.
Evil or racist or perverse.
It is normal, a normal human response to a bunch of people from somewhere else coming to live where you live and where your lineage goes back. It's like, who are these people? And maybe you will move over and make room, and they will assimilate and everything will be great. But that sense of, I live in a neighborhood which used to be white working class. I'm told, people used to leave their doors unlocked. Everyone knew everyone else. It wasn't, prosperous, but it was a real community. Now it isn't. I freely admit I'm part of the problem. I'm one of the incomers. But otherwise, it's just people from all over the world, and there is no sense of community. And you sure as hell better lock your door. Now, that's become a dangerous observation to make. We're supposed to just celebrate that now we have an incredibly diverse neighborhood, and what a wonderful thing that is, that people have made London such a vibrant place to live, which it is. And that is one of the reasons that there are contributions from people from all over the world. But why can't you also say that the nature of the neighborhood I'm living in now has changed to the point where the few people who are still around from the olden days feel a sense of loss? And why should you say to those people, well, you're just racist, you're just a terrible person? I don't believe that's necessary. I think we can be more generous.
As you were speaking, I was wondering to myself, Lionel, have you ever been into a nursery in a city or a primary school? Because all I would say is that when these tiny 2-year-olds and 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds are growing up with like 40 languages spoken in the nursery, they don't see other, they don't see race. You can see that as far as these little kids are going, they're just kids. And it's only as an adult that you can sort of see the race. This is something that we learn. Would you?
Well, I hope that's true.
No, it is true, because I've had children in inner city nurseries, and I have to tell you, it is a beautiful thing to see this, that they don't see race. This is not part of the conversation over the Play-Doh. So this is something that society, a bit like with gender, this is something that society teaches. You're a BAME, this is your culture, this is your gender. It is learnt behaviour, and it's also a learnt attitude, I would contend. But I hear what you're saying. I'm not denying what you've said. I'm just pointing out that if I don't have to repeat myself. But this is a learnt attitude and probably a learnt behaviour. But maybe also it's an atavistic one. If the Anglo-Saxon... I have a house in the country. You never see, very rarely see, somebody from a minority. They don't like coming to London because they think their country's been taken over by minorities. So, this stuff is real. We should acknowledge it. So you're right to raise it.
Well, I'm glad if young children are not especially alert to race, or I would be happy for them not to be alert to gender either.
It's my contention that they aren't, and that this is learned or forced on them.
Okay, but current cultural trends are going in the opposite direction. And certainly in the United States, a lot of little children, even as young as in nursery school, are being instructed to be, if they're white, they have to be aware of their white privilege and go stand in the corner. And this critical race theory crap is filtering down to very little kids. And I think it's evil.
Okay, Lionel, I'm aware of the clock. And can I bring you to the two questions at the top of this podcast, which are, can you think over your life? What was a really difficult moment in your career professionally first?
Well, I guess I'd identify two. It was right before I started We Need to Talk About Kevin, and I was profoundly discouraged by my failure to make a mark in the world of letters, and had already written one novel that didn't ever see print. I couldn't get anybody to publish it. And I had to push myself to write one more book. And I had no way of knowing at that time that book would make any difference. And I had no idea whether it would ever be published. The chances looked low. So I, made a leap of faith and wrote another book. But in my latter career, I would say the difficulty has been perhaps having been published too much. So when I stick my neck out, my head gets chopped off. So I've been through, I would identify 3 different moments of, I guess we'd call it a near cancellation. The efforts to make me go away have not been successful, but that entailed having to really hold the line. And I think part of the secret was not trying to please people who didn't wish to be pleased and not apologizing. I have never apologized for anything I've written. I've sometimes objected to the fact that what I've written has been twisted and reformulated and to make it easier to attack. But I have never withdrawn something that I have published and regretted it in public.
Okay.
And that takes a certain holding of nerve.
I bet it does, especially when you have your publishers maybe saying, just issue a little, couple of lines to say you didn't mean it. But that, of
Fortunately,
course,
nobody at my publisher is so stupid as to make the request that I make a public apology.
What about in your personal life? I mean, obviously we've spoken about your brother's premature death. What stands out as a really, really hard patch?
Oh, without a doubt, the most painful part of my personal life was when I left my previous partner for my now husband. And my previous partner and I had been together for 9 years. He was a wonderful man, had always been incredibly loyal to me. I owed him, I still loved him. But I had fallen head over heels in love with my husband in a much more urgent sense and had to leave. And it was horrible. It filled me with a sense of self-hatred, frankly. And the moment I will never forget, especially, is when I physically left my partner and my future husband was back in New York. My partner went with me to the airport and carried my luggage, and here I was leaving him, and saw me all the way to the security gate and waved me goodbye on the other side and started to cry. And that was just horrible. That was horrible.
It sounds like he had forgiven you, but he knew that you wouldn't forgive yourself.
No, I don't think I've ever quite forgiven myself for that. I mean, the story has a happy ending. I'm very happily married. My partner got married himself to someone else 2 years later. We're still in touch. We're on good terms. But I think one of the hardest things to do if you have a conscience is to sacrifice someone else's feelings for your own happiness.
Wonderful note to end on, a happy ending. I hope a happy ending, Lana. It sounds like it worked out.
It did.
I'm very, very grateful for your time. Lana Shriver, thank you very much for being this week's Difficult Woman.
I've enjoyed talking to you.
Thank you very much for listening to this episode of Rachel Johnson's Difficult Women.